Okay, welcome to our lunch debate today. We will discuss today economic weaknesses and demographic challenges, so that's a fairly broad title. The reason is we have this report that is produced by a group of academics under, can I say, the leadership of Hans-Werner Sinn, or he's one of this, at least he's writing the foreword. The group includes John Driffill, Torben Andersen, Giuseppe Bertola, Harold James, Jan Egbert Sturm, Branko Urošević, and Hans-Werner Sinn. I don't know who leads, but so this is a report that comes out annually and looks at the European economy and then always chooses one or two or three special chapters with different focuses. But the chapter one is always macroeconomic conditions and outlook, which is what John will mostly talk about. And then Torben, I think you will talk about intergenerational fairness, but also about Denmark, a bit the Danish system, but mostly about intergenerational fairness. So thank you to both of you for coming today and for presenting that report. And of course, Pia Hüttel is well known in this house. She's a researcher here, and she will be the discussant today and give her comments to the two presentations. And then we open it up for the audience. I think, John, being British, there may be one or two questions on the UK issue. We discussed that quickly. So I think that's certainly something that also will have material impact on the European economy. So, I mean, it is not just a matter for the UK, whether the UK leaves or not. It is a matter also for the rest of the continent. And I think many in this room would be very curious to have a few thoughts by you on this whole issue, even though now it has become much more burning than it was when you finished that report here. But certainly my take is that after this weekend, perhaps the chances of a no vote have increased, and so I think more and more people would be interested in understanding what is your thinking on this. So I think that's more or less the plan. We have half an hour presentation, then Pia will discuss, and then of course the debate with the audience. John, please. Thank you so much again.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting us to speak at this event today. The report is just published today. Torben, Andersen and I are going to say a few words about a couple of the chapters. It's very kind of you to come, as particularly since, in some sense, the star of the show isn't here. Hans-Werner Sinn, I guess, has been to talk about the report on lots of occasions, and he's kind of particularly charismatic and speaker and a great drawer. So Torben will fill in, supplying some of that famous Danish charisma. And we'll try, we try to rise to the occasion in Hans-Werner's absence, and hope you won't be too disappointed. But in view of his imminent retirement, he wanted to. He didn't want to push himself, and he wanted to step back. Actually, that's what it is. And
that was the term,
yeah. Yeah, he wanted to step back, I think, and make way for the succession. He's going to be succeeded by Clemens Fust in the 1st of April.
Let me try to help you.
I have a couple of slides, but somewhere, but they're not strictly necessary.
This intergenerational.
Yeah.
Is that the one, or
This one.
oh, this one?
There we go. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Well, the
Sorry.
The title of the report, I think, looks as if we threw up our hands in despair. Said, whatever next? But we decided to take a look at some longer-term issues. There are some issues that are too exciting and too fast-moving for us to write about. So we haven't, of course, talked about the migration crisis in this report. We did address migration in last year's report. But migration is much too hot everywhere. And the other thing we didn't address specifically in this report is Brexit. Again, the situation changes too quickly, and it seems much too fast-moving, and everybody is writing about Brexit. So we left that aside, and instead we looked at two issues of kind of medium, long-term importance for Europe, which will be important whatever happens regarding Brexit or anything else, or migration. One is intergenerational fairness, and the bargain between the generations. Another one is developments in secondary education, of which there have been quite a number of policy changes in the UK, France, Italy, and a number of other countries in the last few years. And then looking at two countries or groups of countries that are of particular interest, one being Denmark, which has managed to achieve great things as a small open economy, and has, in some sense, defied many of the constraints that are popularly thought to restrict policy in small open economies. And the last chapter is on the Western Balkans, a group of countries on the eastern edge of the European Union, which have changed enormously over the last few years. Of course, an aspect of that is the fact that joining us on the panel this year is Branko Urošević from Serbia, and so we had a lot of local expertise on which to draw for that chapter. But those seem to be a particularly interesting group of countries in which there has been a tremendous lot of economic and social change over the last few years. I've been asked to talk about the macroeconomic outlook, conditions and outlook chapter of the report, and let me do that briefly. This is a kind of screen dump of all of the pictures in the in that chapter. So I'm not going to talk us through all of them because that would be rather dull. But let me say a few things about one or two features of the report, of the chapter. It's divided in two bits. One is a survey of the current economic and recent economic conditions, and the second part, perhaps a more interesting one, is the outlook for the future. Forecasting in economics is notoriously a mug's game, but nevertheless, even if the answers are terrible, the questions are so interesting. I guess we can't shrink from attempting it. This report, I think, is wonderfully modest in its forecasts. It only looks at forecasts for 2016. We don't actually report any margins of error, but partly because the forecasts and assessments are based on a large number of different sources, which so it's not simply forecasts from a single economic model, so it wouldn't make much sense to provide precise margins of error. This isn't some econometric forecast from a particular model. You know, there's lots of judgments and things have gone into this, and the resources of EFO have used. The general picture, I think, is despite all the uncertainties and worries, is one of modest improvements and a sort of cautiously optimistic story about the world. It's the forecasts are set against the background of low oil prices that are expected to continue, obviously shifting the balance of incomes and fortunes between countries, obviously dreadful for countries like Russia, good for oil consuming and importing countries. There are the risks posed by the war in Syria and the Middle East and the prospect of more refugees, more economic uncertainty. We speak about the risks posed by tightening of monetary policy in the United States, although I rather think, since the report was written, that's kind of gone off the agenda. I think it looks more likely now that the United States is not going to tighten monetary policy. The economic picture over there has weakened considerably, and it looks, that's, I think, been put on hold for rather a long time. And of course, closer to home, there are the uncertainties created by Brexit and the referendum, which now looks likely to take place on the 23rd of June. And of course, some people are anxious about the QE program pursued by the European Central Bank, which creates, in some minds at any rate, the danger of bubbles forming. And also it reduces the pressure on various member states to reform their economies. The general outlook is one of, the report foreshadows, is one of continued global growth of around 3.3%. So 3.3 sounds like spurious accuracy over the coming 12 months, with most of that, of course, coming from Asia. The United States growing fairly robustly at 2.5%, but with unemployment in the US falling slightly, because the United States must be close to capacity at the moment. So what is foreseen is a gradual increase in inflation and modest falls in unemployment. Of course, I mean, in Asia, we've got continued slowdown in China. That's been going on for some time and is expected to continue. Japan has extremely slow economic growth, although, of course, Japan, people talk about Japan's slow economic growth, but the thing is about Japan is that the working population is in decline, and so even as unemployment falls again to what must be close to full employment, 3% unemployment, you've got 1% GDP growth or something like that. But that's really trend GDP growth for Japan, and Abenomics is perhaps running out of steam. One could go around the world. Of course, Latin America is a mixed picture, with countries like Brazil in recession and Argentina and others growing robustly. Overall stagnation. Russia in decline on the back of a collapse in oil revenues, rising unemployment, and collapsing government revenues. And Europe, the picture in Europe is of, as I say, modest recovery, is what the report presents. I mean, this picture, which happens to have come up here right now, is sort of moderately encouraging, is it not? Showing unemployment falling slowly in most European countries, and with significant falls even in Spain and even in Greece, which are forecast to continue, although with pretty sluggish economic growth overall.
But increasing in France.
Growth. Is it in France?
In France, it's increasing.
Yeah. Okay. Unemployment is increasing, not growth.
No.
France is one of the bad guys. France is is just sort of limping along, resisting reform, growing extremely slowly. This is one of the countries that for whom these warnings about diminished pressure for structural change is addressed. Obviously, government. There's huge disparity of growth, of course, across Europe. Absolutely. There's a wonderful picture showing the further in this chapter, showing the wide variety of forecast growth rates. Some of them, Greece still negative, mercifully less than 1%, and some countries steaming ahead. Government structural budget balances, on the whole, improving. Pretty good in the euro area, actually. You'd think, well, this should be okay, shouldn't it? Just a touch under zero for the structural budget balance. But I've got interest rates at rock bottom. Credit conditions marginally improving. Long-term bond yields falling everywhere. We're clearly still heading for a situation where the equilibrium real interest rate is zero or negative, and central banks are going to have a hard time doing anything useful about it, and fiscal authorities can do nothing, of course. There are still very wide disparities in the cost of borrowing for firms around Europe, despite the low interest rates pursued by the European Central Bank. This shows, and let's have a look. There are a couple of, this picture I think is, I'm going to stop in a second because I think the time is running at mine. But this picture is terrific because it suggests that QE in Europe, it has a fantastically stimulating effect by causing the euro to collapse against the dollar. And so it's dropped out of the estimated range of purchasing power parity. That's fantastic for stimulating Europe. This is perhaps the biggest contribution that QE is making to fostering growth in the eurozone.
So
the only thing is that
I mean, the range, the lower and the upper bound. What does it mean?
I'd love to explain, but life is too short.
Okay.
These are estimates which are produced by the EFO.
Oh, it's EFO.
Yeah,
okay.
EFO provides a lot of the data and analysis for this chapter, and we use there. So I can't give you a huge amount of. But this may be indeed from an econometric estimate of purchasing power parity exchange rate and 95% confidence band, or 90% confidence bands around it. Well, it's actually 80%, isn't it? Because we've got the 90th and 10th. So these are 80% confidence bands.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, around the central weight. Oops, and the chart. I think this is interesting because it shows very dramatically the long-term slowdown in Chinese economic growth. Of course, China's growth rate is now below that of India, or at least as forecast for 2016. India is forecast to grow more strongly than the Chinese economy. The confidence generally rising, wouldn't you say, over the last few years in most areas of industry in Europe. And modest growth, that's growth at about 1.9% forecast for the European Union for 2016, mostly from private consumers' expenditure, of course, and growing employment and slowly falling unemployment rates to about 10.5% in the euro area. Oops, and then this is, I'm sorry, it's too tiny to, this isn't a touch screen, so I can't enlarge it conveniently, but it just shows the enormous variation in growth rates across the European Union. Everyone will have this, a large version of this picture in the copy of the report that's in front of you. There you go. So that's the summary.
Overall, relatively optimistic.
Yes,
your group.
I would say cautiously optimistic. Yes, yeah, for modest improvements. Yeah, many risks, and all surrounded by enormous unspoken margins of error. I hand over to Torben.
Okay, Torben.
Okay, thank you very much. So we move on to the...
Use the mic.
Yeah, thank you. So we move on to the chapter on the intergenerational fairness, which is sort of taking a broad perspective on this issue, and a lot of the discussion here is related to the welfare state due to the intergenerational mechanisms running via the welfare state of the public sector. So that also means that many of issues which have been discussed recently, demographic, pensions, etc., pops up in this context. So a main idea of this chapter is to bring this together and see it more generally in the perspective of how different generations fare, given the changes we are seeing and the policy changes being made. So if you look at the charts here, which is showing the age-dependent net transfer, that is, for given age, an average person, what is the sort of net interaction between that person and the public sector? So that means that if it's a negative number, the value of services provided for young people, it could be daycare, for instance, or education. Or if it's positive, it's usually tax payments, either direct income taxes, or it could be indirect taxes paid on your consumption. And then you get a very clear age-dependent profile here. So these are based on so-called individualized expenditure items from the public sector. Of course, there's also collective, like military and others, which you can, well, they cover everybody's classical public goods. But you have in all economies, all public sectors, you have a lot of activities which are individualized in the sense that you know that specific persons benefit from this or contribute to this. Of course, in the public sector, the payment is via general taxation, so the whole idea is that for the individual, there's not a one-to-one relationship between what you pay and what you get. But of course, for the system, there need to be some relationship between the two, otherwise we have problems with the budgets and so on. So what is quite clear from this graph is what you would also expect, a very systematic age dependency, that on average, when you're young, you benefit from the welfare state, daycare, education as the main things, also healthcare and so on, but mainly this. Then eventually you reach ages around 20, 25 something, and you can see the curve crosses zero. That means that you end education, you enter the labor market, you start paying taxes. So now you're in the phase where you're a net contributor to the welfare state, and then eventually you get older, and there's a relationship between age and how frequent you turn up in the healthcare system, and of course pensions and so on kick in at higher ages, retirement, etc. So of course for any age there's also a distribution across individuals at a given age, but here we focus on the age dependency as built into the welfare state. It's also quite clear from the figure that the amplitude of this age dependency depends on the ambitions of the welfare state. So you can see the Swedish one, which is the green line. For the young, they are sort of in the middle, but you can see that tax, as we all know, taxes are higher. So in the middle group where you're supposed to go to work and pay taxes, we can see that the negative, that is from the individual perspective, the net transfer you make is larger. But then when you get older, you also get more back in the Swedish system due to more extensive healthcare and pensions, etc. We did not show that chart. Actually for Sweden, we have historical data, and you can see when you look back from the 30s and 50s and onward, the amplitude gets larger and larger, and that's also what you expect when you get a larger or more ambitious welfare state. Then the amplitude would be larger. You have more daycare, you have more education. That creates expenditures, but then you need higher taxes. Who pay the taxes? That would be those in the middle. So in that sense, in the welfare state, there is a clear intergenerational linkage. There's overlapping generation at any point in time, some being 0, so 2 years, 5 years, etc. So that's very important that we have this overlapping generation. And of course, each individual will run through these phases where first you, on average, will benefit from the system, then you will contribute to the system, and then eventually you'll benefit again. So loosely speaking, we could think of 3 generations: the kids, the parents, and the grandparents. And a bit black and white, before the welfare state, in the family, there was care for the 3 generations under the same roof, the family. That's not the case anymore, but then we have institutionalized the same thing with the 3 generations, but now it's under the roof of the welfare state. Of course, with huge differences across countries, because there are systematic differences in the extent of the welfare state. But as you can see, the pattern is the same in all countries. And that, of course, raises a lot of issues in terms of this, the political support for it, the economic sustainability of the system, and so on. And from an economic perspective, there are various aspects which are interesting here. One is, of course, that it's obviously related to distributional aims. When we have more ambitious welfare state, it's usually the political motivation is related to distribution, to making sure that everybody can get healthcare or education and so on, equal opportunities and so on are in there. And of course, when you have something which is, in an exposed sense, helps you out, if say you lose your job, you get unemployment benefits, or if you lose the ability to work, you get disability pension or whatever, then ex ante it would also provide an insurance function. You know it's there if you're the unlucky guy who's affected by these social events. On the other hand, if you're the lucky guy who goes through life not experiencing any of these negative social events, you will on average contribute more to the system. But that's like any insurance contract, that there would be this thing. So that's going on. Then, of course, there is this specific aspect related to the intergenerational linkage here. So let me loosely put a line here, and then we can think of the social contract or the implicit contract as actually being made up of two contracts. Namely, the first one here, where you start receiving, and then the early ages where you work and pay taxes, then you sort of pay back for the daycare and for your education. That's sometimes called the forward part of the contract. You could also call it an investment. You get something before you pay back. So implicitly there's kind of borrowing in this. And then of course the second part is the opposite. You still keep paying taxes, and then eventually you get old and you get your old age care or your pension or whatever. So that's the backward part or the saving part. Now, there's a huge literature on this discussing how this could affect the economy, even on strict efficiency aspects. Of course, there's all the distributional aspects and so related to this, but there's also an efficiency aspect because there's a huge difference between the forward part and the backward part, because the forward part has this investment perspective, and actually within the intergenerational contract in the welfare state, you can have investment at the implicit return in the pay-as-you-go scheme, which is the wage growth rate, which is in a dynamically efficient economy smaller than the interest rate. So actually it's cheaper to have this running in the forward part in the contract. But on the savings part, you had the opposite argument that the return in markets, the interest rate is higher than the implicit return in public pay-as-you-go pensions. And that has been the main argument why pensions should be funded. So we have these two aspects, and of course the point here is that the forward part in efficiency, even on strict efficiency terms, can be influential in improving efficiency in the economy. And then of course we have the backward part, which plays a huge important role in terms of distribution and redistribution and social concerns and so on. And I stress this because in a forward perspective, for the system as a whole, it's important that we don't squeeze the forward part too much, because that would be where the dynamic gains, efficiency gains are. And of course the risk currently is that because we have more old people and demographics, etc., that we focus too much on the right-hand side in this figure here. And of course, in this figure, you don't have to make sophisticated computation to work out that if there are more old people, then you'll have a higher concentration of people out here, and that would, if you don't make changes, impose a fiscal burden on the system. I should add, if you look at this chart, you might start wondering, could this be financially viable? Because you have some, it seems that the area under this plus the area over here is larger than the area down here. But then you should remember that this is age, so there will of course be a mortality, and not everybody would experience the 80th or 90th or 100th anniversary. So if you weight these by the survival probabilities, of course you get this into the picture, and then it does not look that bad. Of course, some countries still have a sustainability problem. But for instance, the Swedish one is actually sustainable with the Swedish pension reform and so on, even though it looks as if the old are very expensive. But still in Sweden, after all the magics of the Swedish welfare state, not everybody gets 90. So in that sense, it's sustainable. Okay, so the one important thing here in this contract is, of course, all the demographic changes we see. We have seen, it's not a new phenomenon, but we have seen a trend decline in fertility. A trend decline in fertility is actually very important or crucial for this contract, because fertility population growth is an implicit source of the return in the system. If there's population growth, there's always more young coming into the system. Of course, in the first phase, they need some education, but then they become taxpayers. So I have more and more young entering as taxpayers, and relatively then more young than old who should have a pension. So if the system is always sort of feeded with enough of young people into the system, which gets a job and become taxpayers, then of course you can offer an implicit return, which is basically the growth rate of the wage sum in the economy. And of course the reverse is when fertility goes down, the implicit return in the system falls. And politically that's of course a dilemma, because then when you have fertility boosting the population, you can sort of expand things because you have always the tax base increasing. And that's, of course, more attractive for a policymaker. You can start up all sorts of new things, but now when fertility goes the other way, it turns against you, and just financing what you have already seen from an individual perspective gets a problem, because small generations become taxpayers, large generations should have a pension. And then on top of that, we have the mortality change, or the increase in longevity, which is, of course, I guess, if you single the most important welfare improvement in the recent times, it's the increase in longevity. So it's really dramatic. But of course, for the social contract, there's an issue of how many years do you contribute to the system, and how many years do you benefit from the system. And if you live longer and you don't change the retirement age, of course, the average person would spend a shorter share of life contributing to the system than benefiting from the system, and the social contract would not be viable under this. So that's why, of course, in many countries we have seen a discussion of whether the retirement age could be increased because longevity goes up, and in some countries you also see an explicit indexation of the retirement age to longevity, which also from a fairness perspective makes sense, because then you sort of try to keep a balance between the number of years you contribute to the system and the number of years you benefit from the system. Then we have a third demographic challenge to this contract, namely migration. And as I already alluded to, the interpretation of this as an insurance contract, an implicit insurance contract, and some are lucky and some are unlucky, etc. And we all know that insurance contracts, or insurance is problematic if you have selection problems. So if you don't have migration, you don't have a selection problem, because you're sort of, in quote and unquote, you have the population under control. And then you can have these redistribution mechanisms and etc. going on. But if you have migration, of course, potentially adverse selection could enter into the contract. In particular, if those who immigrate are those who have obtained high education, which was financed by taxes, and then they leave when they are supposed to be taxpayers. And if those immigrants who get in have an employment rate which is below the average of the population, then of course they would tend more to benefit than to contribute from the system. And that is precisely adverse selection mechanisms into the contract. So migration potentially can have huge effects on the financial viability of the contract. And then, of course, across these we have a transition issue, because not all of these changes are obviously new. Fertility decline has been running over decades. The increase in longevity, although it has accelerated in some countries more recently, has also been going on for some decades. So the fact that policymakers have been slow to reform to deal with this also implies that some burden shifting to future generations, because the more you have refrained from reforming the system to deal with this, of course, the more you have to do in the future, and who can deal with it, that would always be the future taxpayers, so that would be future generations. So that's, of course, one of the huge issues right now in the intergenerational fairness or conflict which is being built up, that some cohorts, some generations have really been, you could call it lucky or clever, or used their political power to benefit from this system, and now some younger cohorts, they face the bill, so to speak, of this. So we have a distributional aspect here, both across generations, intergenerationally. Some current elderly, they have had a high return in the contract because the fertility thing I mentioned, they have experienced, they got the gain from the increase in longevity. The retirement age was not increased when longevity went up. Actually, in some countries it was decreased, so the average retirement period in a number of countries today is about the double it was just 20 or 30 years ago. So that's, of course, a huge gain from an individual perspective, but not a sustainable gain. And then we have the young, they faced a falling return in the system. They have the burden of dealing with debt to finance these things, and perhaps the investment in the young education and so on and squeezed in the FIDO or the public budget. So there's been recently a lot of discussion about inequality, which has focused more on the distribution of income at a given point in time. And here sort of we raise an issue saying that there is a huge issue in terms of distribution across generations. And then let me just say that intra-generational, the welfare state is perhaps not that redistributive as it's often claimed to be, because some of those who really benefit from the system are those who get tax-financed education, and they get high incomes. Of course, they pay higher taxes, but they on average also are more healthy. They have longer lives and benefit from the welfare state in their older ages. So in a lifetime perspective, the contract is actually less redistributive than it is in a static interpretation. Okay, let's run through some of these. The first is the entry of the young, and one problem which is well known is and in particular in some countries, the difficulties of young finding jobs. And even those who find jobs, they find temporary jobs in and out of jobs and so on. The chart on the right-hand side is the well-known of the needs, those who are neither in employment or in education. And you can see in some countries, it's close to 1/4 of those in the age group 19 to 29. So that's a significant proportion. And mind you, even for the contract, as we saw earlier, then clearly it's important that the young, they shift into the phase where they become employed and pay taxes. So the welfare model of this contract crucially relies on maintaining a high employment rate. So on top of the distributional or social consequences of having problems with youth entering the labor market, it actually endangers the financial viability of the system. And currently, of course, the big issue is whether the extent to which these high youth unemployment rates translate into long-term unemployment for these cohorts, that they never really regain their position in the labor market and then pass through an entire life where these cohorts have below average employment rates. That would both socially and financially be of a large importance. Then another aspect of this is housing and family formation. In many countries, youth have difficulties in finding houses. It can be short supply, it also be expensive, and of course it's also related to the unemployment problem. If you're unemployed, you don't have much money and so on. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side here, you see the proportion of those in the age group 25 to 35 who still lives at home. And you can see in Southern Europe and some Eastern European countries, it's up to half of this age group still living at home. We put it mildly saying involuntary staying at home here. I guess one can make the claim that very few in this age group would have as their first priority staying at home. So it's really showing a lot of problems in one number and one statistic here. And of course, this raises a lot of issues, not only in terms of labor market, employment and so on, but also in terms of housing market. Why a housing market so inflexible, why it's so difficult for young people, young families to find housing. We see a locking in that people stay in houses, even big houses, when they get older. So there does not seem to be an efficient allocation of housing space. In most countries, houses are very lenient taxed. It's sometimes claimed that this is to the benefit of the young, which is actually not the case, because low taxes on housing is capitalized. So it just increases the prices of the houses to the benefit of the old. And then, of course, the inequality in the distribution of housing and housing wealth plays over into bequests. So there's a reinforcing disequilibrium or inequality mechanism from the situation in the housing market and the taxation and bequest and low bequest taxation implied by this. Then the exit of the young here, and as John already said, this report is not about immigration into Europe, so we focus here more on exit of young educated as one part of the adverse selection into the social contract. And some striking numbers here which are from Italy. If you look at the first graph up here, the blue column is the number of young Italians who are registered to leave Italy going to the UK. And you can see it's a pretty flat, no trend in the blue column. But if you ask in the UK, how many young Italians registered to get a national insurance number, that's the red column, and you can see it's much higher. So there's an interesting data problem here. So if you look at the official Italian statistics, you don't get what is actually going on. And about 60,000 young Italians leave Italy each year. That's quite a lot, and most of them go to the UK. Yeah, so it's quite a lot. And if you look at the lower graph, it shows the age distribution, and the point is that the young. So the young, they leave, and actually 2/3 of those hold a university or college degree. So it's among the better educated who leave. So it's really adverse selection from the top, so to speak. And that, of course.
What is the size of the cohort? Is it 200,000 or 300?
I think it's 300 something. Yeah. So it's not a trivial proportion. No. Yeah. And when you have the young leave, and especially if it's the young who are educated, then in some sense you get a double aging effect, because you have fewer young, and if it's the strong young, you also have fewer potential taxpayers. So the viability of the financial viability of the welfare state or the intergenerational contract is really very vulnerable to this. So this is really a problematic aspect. Of course, Italy is sort of the most extreme case, but you see this also for other countries. Then we have pensions and medical care, and this is, of course, something which has been discussed a lot, obviously. More old would immediately affect the budget, even for unchanged pension schemes and so on. And we have the increase in longevity, and we have this point about increasing the retirement age. You see here the graph showing the relative median income at 65. And the point is that the old has fared pretty well in terms of income, even after comparing to here 2007 to 2014. So one can interpret this positively, saying, well, it shows that the pension schemes are resilient and more countries have more funded pension schemes and so on, increasing replacement rates. On the other hand, it also shows that the burden on the adjustment burden has more fallen on younger cohorts, and you have this tension between cohorts who are carrying the cost of this. And clearly delayed reforms have huge implications here and are shifting cost onto fewer cohorts. Much of the discussion has focused on pensions, and pensions are of course very important, but equally important is the health side. And all countries, they have significant public health care systems, and healthcare is an important part of the intergenerational contract. And we have very strong expenditure drivers on the healthcare side. The obvious one is the demographics, that they're more old, and there's this relationship between age and when you turn up in the healthcare system. And that's also there even if you allow for so-called healthy aging. So it is true that it's not just one-to-one that you have more old, it's a sort of a phase shift, but even if you take this into account, the pure demographic effect is to increase healthcare expenditures. But then health also is characterized by other things. It's an area where you have very high income elasticity. So in process where individuals get richer, there's more demand on the healthcare system. And if the public healthcare systems should sort of deliver satisfactory standards and so on, of course it translates into the public sectors. And especially since there are new opportunities. Luckily, in life sciences, there's a lot of improvements, new and better treatments. And even though some of them also are associated with the standard sort of productivity increases, then they also shift the opportunity frontier. And when these treatments are available, there's also a huge pressure that they should be offered to the population. And it's very difficult politically to say no when there's a new treatment. So this is a very important driver. And then, of course, we have the care part. In particular, old age care is very intensive in human interaction, and human interactions are extremely difficult to make more effective or increase productivity. So that's the classical Bruegel example of things where the relative price goes up. And if the welfare state has taken over many of these activities, of course, Bruegel's cost disease becomes a problem for the public sector. What you see here is the EU Commission projection of the you see both the current or the 2010 level of care and then a projection into 2060. And you see two things. First, you see huge differences across countries, but you can also easily, if you can see the country names, you can also sort of vaguely see a relationship here between the level of these expenditures and the income levels in these countries. So one would expect that when some of these countries get richer, there will also be more increases in healthcare expenditures. And the other thing is, of course, the red column, that the increases, when we look forward, they are rather large. So the financial viability or sustainability of the intergenerational contract is really under pressure. And that applies even in countries where there has been pension reforms. And the reason why it applies there is due to the health side. So this chart we have here is from an OECD analysis. And you can see the green one is the projected public budget burden of aging on pensions. And you can see a lot of variation across countries. In some countries it's even negative, and a few countries it's very close to zero, and then it's large in a number of countries. But the blue column, which is healthcare, is significant for all countries. So the healthcare issue has not really been solved in any country, even those countries who have solved their pension problem. And of course, technically it's easier to solve the pension problem because when longevity goes up, technically increasing the retirement age is a straightforward proposal. But politically it might not be that easy, but technically it's easy to point to this. But when there's improvement in health, life sciences, and you can do new things, how can you finance this? Well, either by increasing taxes, which is not an option most would pick, or you have to make cuts in other areas, which is equally difficult. So that's why the health issues sort of remain on the table. And then, of course, some countries face huge debt problems on top of this, and you could say there's also an implicit debt, namely in terms of environmental problems, which is left to future generations. So to conclude, young generations are squeezed or at a disadvantage for reasons I explained, and the social contract has been very favorable to some cohorts and will be less favorable to younger cohorts. Part of this is a result of failure to adjust in time, but of course also inherently here is an intergenerational distributional conflict, and we see in some countries really some tension growing up, and the Italian case is an obvious example of this. And in medium-term perspective, you can ask how far can you go and how would it affect social cohesion and so on, and then you can say, well, on the other hand, politically, it does not seem that it might be smaller because there will be more old voters. So the political balance is shifting to the favor of the old, and therefore there's a risk that the young would be even more squeezed. So this is a tricky issue. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let's now turn to Pia. Pia is the author of one of the authors of a recent Bruegel study on the intergenerational conflict. I think she will probably present something from that report also, and of course from own experience. Can only confirm the Italian story. I mean, we get a lot of applications, certainly from young Italians, to come and work here at Bruegel as research assistants and so on. And so I think that's, I mean, certainly something that is very visible also in not just in the UK, but also here in Brussels. So I think it is indeed a big issue. But Pia, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to the speakers. It was a really interesting report, and it was a pleasure reading through it. It definitely gave a lot of food for thought, especially the chapters. And in fact, as Guntram highlighted, I will focus more on chapter 2, which was talking about intergenerational fairness. But I also have a small remark on chapter 1 regarding the paragraph about monetary policy, and often the link is made between the ECB quantitative easing program and structural reforms. And I would say it's not the role of the ECB to care about structural reforms in countries. And even with the 2% inflation rate, maybe structural reforms would be easier to implement than with 0% or even deleveraging and deflationary environments. That was my small remark on chapter 1. In chapter 2, basically, it's a really comprehensive analysis of the intergenerational divide, and it raises really important points and invites to further reflections on the topic. It's actually more comprehensive than the one we have written, because we focused more on education and the pension, whereas you also address housing issues and also wealth and taxation of inheritance. So it's really a topic, I think, that covers a chapter that covers the topic broadly. And I think the main theme is basically that the generational contract is under threat. So on one hand, you have the medium voter, whose age is basically increasing. So politicians become more and more biased towards the elderly, and hence safeguard more spending on the elderly as opposed to spending on youth, such as education. And what was also discussed in the chapter, what I missed a bit from the presentation maybe, was that this idea of the young voters that actually might opt out, so that they, through migration, exit this national scheme and therefore go away. It was addressed in the brain drain discussion, obviously from Italy, but I think in the report you stress it even more. And I have two small remarks. One is really, really small. It's basically when you showed the unemployment rates and how they are really high for the young, you looked at the not in employment, education and training indicator, and I think it's a bit difficult to interpret. In the report you're writing that those not in employment or education are those who are discouraged, and that they opt out from the formal labor market and trading altogether. This would mean that 25% of Spaniards are discouraged. I think that's overstated, because we talk about people that are unemployed or inactive. Unemployed means that they are still looking for a job. So they might be students just coming out from school, and they look for the first time for a job. And this, in fact, in Spain, if you decompose the not in education and training, you can see that the big chunk is unemployed persons. It's not inactive, which are completely discouraged. This is a small remark. The second one is more about the pension challenge that you are addressing. So basically, you're saying that the pay-as-you-go system is under threat because of fading productivity, but also increased longevity and decreasing fertility rates. And as a solution, you suggest to switch from a defined benefit to a defined contribution system. So for who is not familiar with these terms, so defined benefits is basically where you keep the benefits as they are. So the cost will fall on the young, because the benefits will stay the same, but the young who are paying into the system are getting less. So obviously their contribution rate is increasing. So at the extreme, all the cost of adjustment will fall on the younger generation. Whereas the defined contribution means that you basically decrease the benefit that elderly are getting. So you have the cost that falls on the elderly as fewer contributions are paid in, and the benefits are hence reduced. So on both extremes, the systems look unsustainable. And this is where I can finally cite the paper we have written together, because we look at something called the Musgrave rule, where we basically identify it as a third option to kind of safeguard this social contract that you are describing. And the Musgrave rule basically plays a bit with both. It plays both with the contributions and the benefits, so that you keep constant the benefit wage, which would be the average pensions divided by the average wage, which would in a certain way not alter the distribution from the elderly to the young, or vice versa. So we were opting to this third one, and I would like your comment on this one. I think it's a nice solution out of this dilemma. And I will also like to give a more positive outlook on the median voter growing older and hence capturing politics. I do still believe that people are interested in the new risk coming up, and we did a survey within this report, and it was done across 7 countries in August 2015, and we were asking people what are the main challenges that are there for the welfare state looking ahead. And basically, nearly 50% of people cited education as the biggest challenge. So I would say that the policy attention is there, and it might not be that politicians are so captured by elderly voters, as you were stating in the report. Thank you a lot. That was it. And I'm happy for your feedbacks.
Great. Thank you very much. So let's open the discussion, but also, of course, Torben, if you want to react already to the Musgrave rule and why you sort of didn't opt for that one, because we were opting for it. And just to repeat what Pia said, the Musgrave rule, of course, tries to split the burden of aging equally among those that work and those that are in pension, and so it seems to be, to me, quite a nice solution in terms of the intergenerational equity. While you seem to favor the system shifting completely to the other one, but if you want to react later, I can also collect some. Yeah,
I'd be happy to.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for very good comments. Let me just quickly run through them. First, on the unemployment, I agree that looking at this needs does not imply that all which are included there are sort of disadvantaged or discouraged or anything like that, because as you point out, some of them are unemployed, they look for jobs. I think the spirit in which we put it up is just to say that we have that in this group, those who are in this group have a high probability of becoming marginalized in the labor market, and that's really the point, not a strict interpretation of 25% or 20%. So that's really the problem, that because then you have what is sometimes called lost generations, that you have some cohorts entering the labor market where all sorts of problems are there, and they never get really a strong position in the labor market, and they are long-term unemployed and so on. But I agree on the point. On the pension, I think this is a very interesting discussion. I think actually we don't go very far into discussing the finer details of pension reforms. So first we just point out that if you don't do anything, then a pay-as-you-go pension scheme obviously will be under severe problems. And then we briefly say, well, increased new retirement age makes sense, and of course also having more funded pension schemes makes sense, but we don't go far into the discussion. I would maintain that as a medium-long run policy objective, moving towards more funded pension scheme is the right way to go. But having said medium-long run, I also indicated that then we are talking 40, 50 years or more. So there's quite a while until there. And there's an issue, how can we then adjust the current systems? And I think this discussion about the Musgrave rule is a very interesting rule, and it has precisely, as you say, it's sort of balance between the young and the old, and in that sense maintains a kind of fairness in the adjustment burden. So I think that's for sure very interesting. Then on the median voter and the fact that at least numerically the age of the median voter increases, and there are forecasts saying that in 2040, 50, in most countries, more than 50% of the voters would be above 60 years old. So that's really a shift. Now, would all old only vote for higher pensions? Or would some old, either out of altruism, think of the young, or even rational median voter would think, if we squeeze the young too much, there'll be nobody to pay the taxes. And then it doesn't matter anyway. For instance, pushing the young Italians to go to the UK, because then they vote with the feet rather than in the ballot. So there's a literature on rational voters and how they would perceive the need to also care for the young, because if they are not caring for the young, they are sort of undermining their own position. But even those models have as a prediction that when the age distribution shift towards higher ages, then policies would shift to be more favorable to, let's just call it pensions. But not that it would be entirely pensions, because they would understand that they should also maintain some education and so on, but still the balance would shift. So and I think that's the important point here. It's not a 0-1 discussion that's not we go to extreme, but it's just slightly that whenever there's political discussions about how should the budget be adjusted and so on, there is a tendency that less would happen on the pension side and more on the education side. That's basically the point we're trying to make.
Thank you for Stasinopoulos, formally with the European Commission. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, for a good study. I have not seen. I was surprised to read in the economic press in England, in UK, and I read some statements by the chief economist of OECD, in which the overall assessment is rather pessimistic about the prospects for globally and for the European Union. And they put a lot of emphasis on deficient demand. And therefore, they argue that we need to boost demand for growth and employment. Within the European Union, of course, there is Draghi, which is doing his job with the monetary policy. We have the Juncker's investment initiatives. Both of them, if we take them together, they go in the right direction of boosting demand. There is no doubt about that. But my question is for John Driffill. Your study, what was the feeling? Is there any evidence that really should we take very seriously? Okay, the OECD is a very serious think tank. Is the demand so deficient? Because this may imply somehow, I mean, I got the impression that this is the latest conversion of OECD into the Keynesian economics. I didn't expect that, actually. But that's my question for John, and also for you, Gudrun, because we know quite well the economic profession in Germany. They have a slightly different, let's say, orientation vis-à-vis some of the things that happen around.
Kurt Geisert from Stuttgart Region European Office. I have a question for Mr. Andersen. I was impressed by your number, 60,000 young Italians going to the United Kingdom in order to work there, because I remember a conference in the Tuscany office in Brussels, I think it was in 2012, with the president of Tuscany, with the Commissioner Laszlo Andor for Social Affairs, etc. And there was more a mood, no, we are against this sort of brain drain. So my question is, has the mood changed in Italy?
Please.
Yeah. Maria de Berghi from the European Commission. On the economic outlook, we hear a lot about heightened uncertainty. Both the Fed and the ECB last week mentioned that there was a huge uncertainty in the transmission mechanism. And actually, even in the European Commission, there's been a huge discussion on the way that uncertainty weighs on our forecasts. Are we justified to be so confident because we constrain optimism? Or is this just wishful thinking and down the line we're going to have to upgrade our forecast yet again? That's one question. The second question, if you were to comment on Brexit, can you tell us what this means for Scotland? Because it seems to me that either way, we're going to have another demand for a referendum. And is that
All right, let's, I think that's the first round. It's already a lot of, John, I think it was, I will also say something, but please.
What first?
So on demand, I mean,
Demand,
so,
aggregate
so
demand.
you're British, I mean, so not the German conservative. So.
Well, despite being British, I mean, the signs are that it may have been helpful to have had more aggregate demand, and of course there has been a big argument in Britain that the policies of the current government have slowed down the recovery, but eventually a recovery has taken place and unemployment has been falling. Of course, the thing that's been missing in the UK has been productivity growth. I mean, higher employment's perhaps achieved by a flexible labour market has come up with less productivity growth. But it does seem to be true in quite a lot of Europe that there's good economic growth happening in the United States. As Japan also approaching capacity. I mean, real economic growth, aggregate GDP growth is quite slow, but then that's because the population of working age is falling. So I mean, surprisingly, there does seem to be enough demand, and there seems to be adjustments on the supply side taking place, so that we're getting this slow recovery. I mean, more demand some years ago might have speeded it up, and there are big chunks of Europe where more demand would obviously be very helpful. I mean, it is true that inflation is a lot lower than target in Europe, and Mario Draghi hasn't, and the ECB have not so far been able to get inflation up, and the trends in inflation are still downward. So from that perspective, perhaps you would say, yes, a bit more aggregate demand would be a good thing. See, Japan too, Abenomics has not, they've not managed to get the rate of inflation up to the target of 2%. It's still languishing between 0 and 1. So yeah, it's maybe there is still a need for a bit more demand. But the supply side has been, of these economies have responded better than one might have expected, I think. But well, the uncertainty about public policy and other things is one thinks is always likely to reduce demand and growth a bit, but by how much, I don't know. And of course, these forecasts, they're meant to be forecasts, so they're meant to be. I mean, the margins of error might be huge, but we're not trying to do any wishful thinking here. I mean, we're not saying that there's cautious optimism. It's not cautiously optimistic because we'd like to be, but because we think that that's the sort of central estimate. But yeah, of course, we may be revising our forecast down next year, or up, or up, who knows. And Brexit, well, yeah, I'd have thought, yes, if the UK votes for Brexit in June, the Scots are going to redouble their attempts their efforts to separate from the rest of the UK, because they're much more pro-European, I think, on the whole. Mind you, I think whatever happens about Brexit, there is going to be more demands for referenda on Scotland. Actually, if the United Kingdom votes not to leave the EU, I suspect there'll be another demand for a referendum on Brexit as soon as anyone can get away with it. So it's not going to kill off. These questions aren't going to get killed off, I don't think.
So it wouldn't hold like in the 75 or another 40 years, so?
Well, but there's been simmering discontent in the UK, hasn't there, since in certain quarters since 1975. But perhaps it would. I mean, perhaps this is such a painful. Perhaps it would be such a painful experience that it would kill off further discussion. And obviously, I don't know. But I think the discontent has grown to much greater proportions of the population in Britain, and that's why I think now it would be. It would be an issue that wouldn't go away. I mean, 1975, Europe was much less of a thing, wasn't it? It was much more, it was doing less.
Right.
The progress towards ever greater integration of the European nations had scarcely begun, really. I mean, there was the common market and not a whole lot else at the time, if I recall correctly. Whereas now it's actions extend into much wider areas of social and economic policy.
You asked about the German Orthodox. So I mean, I think, I mean, just to perhaps say 2-3 words on this. I think perhaps many economists in Germany would actually accept the notion that there's not enough demand, but they would disagree on how to manage to get more demand. And I think that there's basically a very strong line of thought that would argue that the key issue is the unresolved structural problems, including, debt overhang, a defunct banking system that's not restructured, and so on, and that is holding back demand. And so you clean that up with structural reforms, and then you basically get your growth going. That is, I think, the view of many economists. But I personally think that Mario Draghi has put it rather well to say, you know, we need the demand side and the supply side. I mean, we need to fix these deeper issues, including, by the way, the productivity issues that, you know, have been with us for 20 years in some countries, including the country where 60,000 people are emigrating from. I mean, this country has had no productivity growth for 20 years. So if you don't fix that, I mean, it's not with fiscal policy that you're going to fix the Italian issues, yeah. But I mean, so you need those things as well. So you need the double strategy. You need the structural and the demand side. But there was a question also to you, I think, and then let me collect one more.
Yeah, there was the question about the Italian.
Please use the micro.
Oh yes,
sorry.
The brain drain. I wish that Giuseppe Bertola was here because he's our Italian member of the group and he could answer much better. I would be a bit cautious in saying something about the mood in Italy. From what I understood also when we discussed this text and this part, there does not seem to be a change in the mood and this thing is going on and yeah, there's no sign that fewer young would leave Italy. So the brain drain thing is there. Yes. Yeah.
If I see the graphs on page 60 of your report, it shows that the numbers of people going out in 13 are much higher than in 12. So there might have been a change. Yeah.
Okay, let me collect a few more. You and then Alvaro, please.
Yeah. So Julien Rousson, DG Employment. On intergenerational transfers, I had one general question. Don't we lose from the picture given the fact that standards like in the 1960s in some European countries when it comes to accepting employment, to finding housing were very different from what they are now? So whether we should not also forget maybe this aspect when we compare the outcomes from the generations now with older generations which on paper look luckier, but maybe the reality was not. Maybe we forgot a bit what was the reality also in the 1960s. You find employment, you find housing, but this would be assessed maybe as housing which is not decent or employment with very low quality or very low income. And a second remark, which is more factual and focused maybe, is the graph to which you gave prominence about intergenerational transfers. So you flagged the specific case of Sweden, but checking in the report, page 55, the data for the member states showed are very old. So Sweden, the pension reform was only very gradually implemented, and they phased out the survivor's pension, and now relative poverty of older women is increasing in Sweden. Of course, Sweden is doing well overall in terms of tackling poverty, but the picture given may be now a bit outdated, at least for Sweden. Thank you.
Alvaro.
Professor Andersen, you mentioned the increase in longevity, and how straightforward it would be to just increase the retirement age. But I've read evidence that, for example, in the US, these increases in longevity have been rather unequal across income classes. So it's mostly high-income people who have seen increases in their longevity. Do you know if this is the case also in Europe, and how would you address this?
And I take a third question. Please, yes.
I was wondering, going back to the example with Italians leaving for UK, it seems like this is becoming a problem when you look at this from the intergenerational divide, which might not have been discussed as much as the whole brain drain educational part of this problem. Do you think this problem has been overlooked in terms of the intergenerational divide issue, that people are using the freedom of movement in the European Union? And also, it seems to be a political problem in both the countries of origin and the countries of destination. Taking the example with Italy, one might imagine that this could lead to a very big problem for Italy if the Italians are staying, of course, in the UK. And when you look at UK, you see right now in the Brexit debate that there's a huge majority who wants to limit or even abolish freedom of movement, and that's a big part of them wanting to leave the EU. So it seems like it causes problems on both sides. How do you see this?
Okay, Torben, I think most were for you. If I may rephrase the last question a bit more provocatively, so shouldn't the Italians actually favor Brexit, because then the Italians would be sent back to Italy and solve the demographic problem in Italy? But I mean, that was just a joke, of course. So,
thank you.
It was just a joke, of course. I'm just rephrasing your question. I'm sorry. So Torben, please.
Thank you for these very good questions. First, on the question about comparison across generations, because you raise an issue which is not easy, because if we take an entire lifespan and then want to compare with other cohorts born later, how do we compare? Because living standards in 1960 obviously were much lower than they are today, etc., and etc. The convention in the literature is to correct for the productivity growth over time, such that you say that future productivity growth would be something which future generations would have. And this can be discussed. It's not necessarily the truth, but the one reason for doing that is if you don't do that, then you will have a very strong distributional implication, namely that you should do whatever you can to front-load redistribution to older cohorts, because they are pretty poor cohorts and future generations would be fantastic rich. And that's probably taking a bit too far. So that's the reason why this is usually done. But this can be discussed. And the other thing about Sweden, you're absolutely right on the numbers here. The reason why they are a bit dated is that we wanted to have more numbers than just actually Sweden and Denmark, because we have very precise data on this in both Sweden and Denmark. For the reason that we have everything registered on individuals and numbers, so we can make these individual decompositions very precise. And the reason, as I said, we want to have more countries here, and I'll be happy to show you those numbers. If you look at Sweden over recent years, then as I said, if you take the long trend, the amplitude got bigger. You had more expansion of the welfare state, and it was sort of dragged out, this curve. Then the recent reforms after and in particular the pension reform, has lowered in particular this thing out for the old. So if you compare, if you had the recent numbers for this year with those you have in the chart for, say, above the age of 60, it would go down a bit. Not below the other countries, but it would come down. So that's really what the reform, one element of this reform is that the average old gets less from the contract due to these reforms. So your point is absolutely right that there's this movement, which you don't see from the chart which we produced here. Then there's the question on longevity and possible differences across social groups, because the increase in longevity is not equally shared. And first, as a fact, yes, that's true. But the question is whether, and the main reason why it's true is that some groups who have various health problems, of course, even though mortality rates falls for other people, it would not be falling. So that would usually be people who would be eligible, at least in some countries, would be eligible for disability pensions. So one can ask, yes, there is this problem, but is it a problem which should be solved within the pension system generally, or should it be solved because it has to do with other problems? Because if you want to solve it within the pension scheme, you get that you need very low retirement age, because then everybody should be allowed in, and that means that a lot of healthy, still capable of working, should be allowed out. That would not, under any reasonable criteria, be a good way to sort of solve this. Related to this, just to raise something which, at least for many, would be a provocation, is that if you start thinking about could we make retirement ages depending on some criteria, the first thing which come up is the difference between males and females, because females have on average longer longevity. So on that reasoning, they should have higher retirement age. I have difficulties finding any policymaker which would propose that, right? So the most clear difference in longevity is already under unisex sort of ruled out. But it's an important discussion, but I think it has more to do with disability pension and such. Then there's this thing about Italy and Brexit and so on. It's well-established empirical facts that immigration flows in and out of countries are very closely related to economic development in countries. So the fact that there's out-migration from Italy is no surprise, given as it was said that they have had low productivity growth for many years and so on. Ireland is perhaps the best example where you can see huge flows for many years out, and then we had the Ireland doing very well, huge inflows, and then the crisis, some going out again, and so on. So clearly, these migration flows are sensitive to the economic performance, and in that sense, an indicator of what's going on in comparative perspective in countries. And that's also related to your question about, let me put it slightly different. There's a lot of discussion about migration and how it affects the welfare state, and it has a tendency to focus on those coming in and benefiting from the system, often forgetting that some high-income groups who have got got a lot of education tax financed actually have a strong incentive to leave, and when they leave, they really they leave the implicit contract. And of course, optimally, if you leave at the age 25, 30, got a university degree, say in one of the Nordic countries, you did not pay anything yourself, and then you go to, say, the UK, you will go to a country where you pay lower taxes and you have a much higher wage dispersion because people come with private financed education, and then of course your return of moving to the UK is extremely high. So this tension in the contract is there, and that was what we want to point out as sort of balancing discussion, which has much focus on the other side of it. Yeah.
Did you want to say something still, or?
I'm just reminded that Morten Raven is a vociferous speaker in favour of Britain staying in the European Union. Morten is Morten's an economist at University College London, who I think was educated in Denmark, but subsequently moved to the UK. But I'm pleased to see that he's a vigorous supporter of Britain's remaining in the European Union. I mean, of course, this free, people moving between countries was one of the plans, wasn't it? Free movement was intended to be one of the safety valves and one of the adjustment processes that would help a single currency area hold together. That you have these, where there's high unemployment and low incomes, people can move. And of course, it's Pareto. Well, it's socially improvement. It's not a Pareto improvement, but it's a potential Pareto improvement. And if all these Italians are, they're probably economics lecturers and economics students. The British higher education, if we left, we may as well, apart from one or two of us, a few old natives, the rest of British higher education may as well move back to Italy and Greece and Spain and everywhere else. It's a mystery, really, why it's happening in Britain at all. The staff are from other European countries. The students are from other European countries. Very nice of everyone to come and do it in Britain, which those of us in the business appreciate. But it does raise various questions. Yeah. But,
all right, Pia, did you want to say a final word?
I think just the final remark on the migration debate. I think I found it quite nice the option you gave, saying that given that there is this labor mobility and people getting out of the national contract, one of the options would be to actually think about the European sort of mutualization, which is a line of reasoning I haven't come across before, I have to admit. So I really appreciated this line of thought.
A European contract, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you move because of these differences in, as you say, in Denmark you get free education and then you make your money in the UK where you don't pay taxes, and then you retire back in Denmark where you receive generous pension. I mean, we have a problem. If that is sort of the incentives that are given, that's a problem. So anyway, that's another broad discussion. Let me thank our speakers and our audience, and let's conclude for today. So thank you very much, and let's give a round of applause.